In the last days of January 1792, in a shuttered house in the south of France, a woman of 34 sat putting her affairs in order. She was heavily pregnant, far from home, attended by a small party who called the journey a cure and meant something else by it. Laid out near her were the papers she had spent those days preparing: a will dated the 27th of January, a policy of life insurance taken out for £1,000, and letters written in her own hand to her 3 children in England to be opened only if she did not come back. Beside her sat her dearest friend. Somewhere in the house, a little girl of 6 was playing. She was not ill. She was preparing to die in childbed, and if she lived, to give the coming child away. The world knew her as the Duchess of Devonshire, the presiding hostess of fashionable and political London, the wife at the head of one of the greatest fortunes in Britain. This shuttered room was the truer picture. And the thing being arranged inside it, the secret birth of the surrendered child, the silence closing over both, was not a private misfortune. It was a procedure. Her own family had run it before and would run it again. What follows is the story of how the grandest people in England dealt with the children they could not afford to acknowledge. Told through the sisters it broke, the babies it hid away, and the long labor carried on for generations after everyone was dead, of keeping all of it out of the record. It is colder than any scandal, and far more human. The world saw the dazzle. This is what the dazzle cost. To understand how a woman like that, the most recognized face in a country that did not yet have photographs, the daughter of one of the oldest fortunes in England that came to be where we have just found her, you have to go back. Not a handful of years, generations. You have to go back to the houses that made her, and to the law that stood behind those houses like a second father and was colder than the first. This is the story of 3 families who learned to do the same thing to their own children and who never once called it cruelty. It is the story of the Spencers, the Cavendishes, and the Ponsonbys, of sisters and cousins, and the men who married into the money, and the men who did not have to. It runs across more than half a century, through palaces in St. James's and a house in Derbyshire larger than some towns. And it ends, as these stories tend to, in paperwork. It is the story of what the great names demanded of the women who carried them, and of the children those women were made to surrender. Some of those children were given new surnames. Some were sent across the channel. One of them survives today as almost nothing at all. A single certificate, folded once into a small satin purse, sitting now in a London archive among the papers of people who never knew her face. But the renaming and the sending away came later. First there were the houses, and to understand why a newborn child could be a danger to a house, you have to understand first what these houses were and what they were built to protect. That the names meant permanence. That was the whole point of them. In a country that prized continuity above almost everything, a name like Spencer or Cavendish was not merely a family, it was an institution, a fixed point, a promise that the land and the title and the seat in Parliament would pass down through the male line in an unbroken chain, the same way they always had, the same way they always would. To the world outside, these families looked less like people than like landscape. They had always been there. They would always be there. That was the illusion, and it was a beautiful one, and a great deal of effort went into maintaining it. The Spencers had not always been there. That is the first thing worth knowing. The family rose into the highest tier of English society from comparatively modest beginnings in the late 15th century, and the foundation of the fortune was not glamorous at all. It was sheep, grazing land in the Midlands, wool, careful management, generations of marrying upward and buying more. By the 18th century, the origins had been thoroughly forgotten, or rather thoroughly redecorated, and the Spencers sat among the richest commoners in the kingdom on their way to an earldom. The proof of the climb was made of stone. Between 1756 and 1766, the family built Spencer House overlooking Green Park in St. James's, not a home in any ordinary sense, but a London palace designed for entertaining, for politics, for being seen. You did not build a house like that to live in it quietly. You built it to announce that you had arrived and that you intended to stay. If the Spencers represented the climb, the Cavendishes represented the summit. The Dukes of Devonshire sat at the center of one of the great landed fortunes in all of Britain, and their seat in Derbyshire was the emblem of that scale. Chatsworth had been in Cavendish hands for nearly 5 centuries. The park ran to more than 1,800 acres, the gardens to 100 more. The house itself was a treasury of pictures and statues and rooms designed to make a visitor feel small. This was not the home of a middling gentry family with a comfortable income. This was a dynasty operating at the scale of the state, and the fortune was not static. It grew, the way these fortunes grew, through marriage. One detail from the Cavendish records is worth pausing on because it explains so much of what followed. In the previous generation, the line had absorbed Lady Charlotte Boyle, the sole surviving heir of the third Earl of Burlington. The inheritance she carried into the family, when it descended to her son, very nearly doubled the Cavendish holdings. There is something about that figure worth sitting with for a moment. A single well-chosen marriage could double the wealth of one of the richest houses in England, which is another way of saying that a single badly managed bloodline could threaten it. When everything, the houses, the art, the seat in the lords, the rents from tens of thousands of acres that depended on a clean and unquestionable line of descent, the management of who was born and to whom and under what name stopped being a private matter. It became the central business of the family. This is where the law has to enter the story, because the law was not a backdrop, it was the engine. English law treated a child born outside marriage as a kind of structural problem, a fault line running through the foundation of an estate, because such a child threatened the orderly transmission of property and title and rank through the father's line. The language was explicit, and it survived for centuries. Hereditary peerages descended in the old formula to the heirs male of the body, lawfully begotten. Lawfully begotten. 3 words doing an enormous amount of work. A child not lawfully begotten was, in the eyes of the system, not a lesser heir, but no heir at all. And worse than no heir, a potential source of scandal, of claims, of doubt cast on the legitimacy of the children who did count. So entrenched was this principle that when Parliament finally moved, well over a century later, to soften the legal disabilities of illegitimacy, it took deliberate care to protect the aristocracy from any consequences. The Legitimacy Act of 1926 made certain reforms and then explicitly stated that nothing in it should affect succession to any title or dignity of honor. The titles were walled off, and the broader disabilities of illegitimate birth were not fully abolished in England until 1987, which means that for the entire span of this story, and for nearly 200 years after it, the law itself was quietly insisting that some children were a danger to the houses they were born near. It is important to be precise here, because it would be easy to imagine mustache-twirling villains, fixes in dark coats arranging disappearances. The reality was colder and more bureaucratic than that. Concealment was not for these families an act of spontaneous cruelty. It was estate management. It was, in their own understanding, responsibility. The line had to pass cleanly. The title had to remain beyond question. The great rooms had to remain usable for the great purposes. A woman might suffer, a child might be displaced, a letter might one day be cut to ribbons by a careful descendant, but the line endured. That was the value above all other values, and everyone raised inside these walls understood it before they could have put it into words. There was even a model for what sending a child away looked like in this period, though it sat far below the aristocracy. The Foundling Hospital in London, the great charitable institution for abandoned children, kept careful regulations. A child taken in could be registered, given in effect a new identity, and sent out to a nurse, a foster family in the countryside, away from the city and away from its origins. It was a system built on distance, on the idea that a child could be separated from its beginnings and raised somewhere else under other care. When the great families did something similar, they did it privately, with better houses and more money and far better paperwork. But the underlying principle, that the answer to an inconvenient child was distance, was the same principle, recognizable across the whole society. The poor sent their children to the foundling. The rich had their own quieter arrangements. The instinct ran from top to bottom, and the cost of all of it fell, with crushing reliability on the women. You have to understand what was actually being asked of a woman who married into one of these houses. She was expected to be charming and accomplished and beautiful in public. She was expected to manage a household the size of a small institution. She was expected, above everything, to produce a son, an heir lawfully begotten to carry the name into the next generation, and to do it without complaint, without delay, and without ever allowing any disorder in her own heart to become a fact the world could see. The men of these families could stray, and frequently did, and the system absorbed it. A woman's body, by contrast, was the very ground on which the legitimacy of the line was built. Her fidelity was not a private virtue. It was a structural necessity. And so the whole apparatus of charm and grace and effortless social brilliance that these women were famous for rested on a foundation of enforced silence. They built something magnificent. What they were never permitted to build was a life of their own inside it. That was the world. Now the people who lived in it. She was born Georgiana Spencer in the summer of 1757, the eldest child of the man who would become the first Earl Spencer, and of his wife, Margaret Georgiana, the Countess Spencer. And from the very beginning, she was the radiant center of that family. Her mother adored her with an intensity that bordered on possession. The letters between them, written across Georgiana's whole life, are some of the most tender and most controlling correspondence the period produced. She was raised to be exceptional, and she was exceptional, almost effortlessly so. By her late teens, she was witty, warm, quick, generous to a fault, and possessed of a quality that the 18th century did not have a word for, but that we would now call magnetism. People wanted to be near her. They wanted her to like them. She made every room she entered feel like the place where things were happening. In 1774, at 16 years old, she was married to William Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Devonshire. He was 25. The match was, on paper, perfect. It joined the climbing brilliance of the Spencers to the immovable grandeur of the Cavendishes, and it made a teenage girl one of the most important women in the country overnight. She became the Duchess of Devonshire, mistress of Chatsworth and of Devonshire House in Piccadilly. And then, over the years that followed, she became something stranger and more modern than that. She became famous. Not famous in the way titled people were ordinarily famous, as names in a register of precedence, but famous in the way we would recognize today. Her clothes copied, her hairstyles imitated, her movements reported, her face known to people who would never meet her. She threw herself into Whig politics with a fervor that scandalized the state. In the spring of 1784, during the bitterly fought Westminster election, she did something almost unheard of for a woman of her rank. She went out into the streets, into the taverns and the markets of a rough constituency, and canvassed openly for Charles James Fox. The story that she traded kisses for votes was probably exaggerated, and it was certainly never forgotten. The satirists fell on her. The same public that copied her gowns and her 3-foot hair towers now bought engraved prints depicting her as a wanton, hawking herself for a man's career. There is something worth sitting within that smoke. The speed with which adoration could turn, the way a woman who stepped half an inch outside her assigned role was punished not by the law but by the laughter. She had been raised to be looked at. She was learning in her 20s that being looked at and being protected were not the same thing, and that the gap between them belonged entirely to her. And she gambled ruinously. The debts mounted into the tens of thousands of pounds, figures that would equal millions today, and she concealed the worst of them, borrowing from one source to quite another, terrified of what her husband would say, more terrified still of what her mother would. The gambling was not really about money. It was the behavior of a woman trying to feel something sharp enough to cut through the numbness of a marriage that did not see her. Beneath all of it, the politics, the fashion, the debts, the frantic brilliance, ran a single, simple, devastating want. She wanted to be loved, wholly, particularly for herself. And she had married into a house where that was the one thing on offer that could not be supplied, because her husband could not supply it. Now, William Cavendish, the 5th Duke, is one of the hardest figures in this whole story to write, precisely because there is so little heat in him. He was not a tyrant. He did not rage. He was by nearly every account reserved to the point of coldness, undemonstrative, more comfortable with his dogs and his cards than with the dazzling young wife the world envied him for. The cruelty in him, such as it was not the cruelty of a villain. It was the cruelty of a man who understood the rules of his world so completely and accepted them so totally that he could enforce them without ever appearing to do anything at all. He held the title, the houses, one of the great inheritances in Britain. He did not need to be unkind. The structure was unkind on his behalf. The household joke, repeated for 2 centuries since, was that the Duke kept 3 loves under his roof and divided his evenings unequally between his wife, his mistress, and his dogs, and that the dogs came off best. It is the kind of joke that is funny only until you imagine being married to the man, 16 years old at the wedding, pouring out warmth toward a husband who met it with the mild, distracted courtesy he might extend to a guest who had stayed slightly too long. And this is the asymmetry the whole story turns on. He was, even in these early years, already living the double standard that would one day destroy his wife without the slightest danger to himself. The person who made that double standard a daily fact in the household was Lady Elizabeth Foster. Bess, as everyone called her, was the daughter of the eccentric Earl Bishop of Derry, a woman of intelligence and charm and almost no money of her own. By the time she crossed Georgiana's path, she was a kind of genteel castaway, separated from a husband who had kept the two small sons, dependent on the kindness of friends and relations, drifting through the spa towns where the displaced and the hopeful gathered. They met at Bath in 1782, two young women in a town built for the convalescent and the bored, and the friendship took hold with a speed that everyone around them remarked on. Georgiana, starved of intimacy in her own marriage, found in Bess a companion who seemed to understand her completely, who listened, who needed her. It felt at first like the great friendship of her life. Within a short time, Bess had become the Duke's mistress as well as the Duchess's closest companion. She would go on to bear the Duke two illegitimate children, traveling abroad for the births and then returning to the household as though nothing had altered. She is the most morally complicated figure in the saga, and she should never be reduced to a simple villain. She was a woman shaped by male appetite and her own precarity, a person with almost no power who learned to survive by making herself indispensable to people who had a great deal of it. She was both a victim of the arrangement and one of its essential instruments. Remember her because she is the living proof, present in the house from the start, that the Devonshires already knew exactly how to make a hidden child disappear. Against the cold center of that marriage stood Charles Grey. He was young, handsome, ambitious, a rising star of the very Whig politics Georgiana lived for, and he offered her the one thing Devonshire House had been built to make impossible, which was the feeling of being chosen by someone who wanted nothing from her but herself. It would be easy to make him purely romantic, the lover against the cold husband, and the script must resist that because Grey belonged to exactly the same world and shared exactly its assumptions. He would go on to a remarkable life. He became the second Earl Grey and Prime Minister and gave his name to the Great Reform Act of 1832 and in legend to a blend of tea. But in the heart of this story, he is something smaller and sadder, the beloved who could not protect her, because the logic that would punish her was his logic too. And out of that love came a child the entire system was designed to erase, which is precisely why she cannot be treated as a footnote. Her name was Eliza Courtney, and her name was the first weapon used against her. Scholars who study how illegitimate children were named in this period note that the surname chosen often signaled everything: the relative standing of the families involved, the foster arrangement, the degree of concealment intended. Courtney gave no hint of who her father was. It pointed nowhere. It was in itself a small machine for hiding her. Eliza is the first full embodiment of what this family did to its inconvenient children. Born in secrecy, taken from her mother almost at once, handed to a foster nurse, and then routed quietly into another household under a name that told no truths. She was not destroyed. She was made to exist only in a diminished, deniable form. Hold on to her too. Then there is the sister, because this was never the story of one woman's misfortune. Henrietta Frances Spencer, Harriet to her family, was Georgiana's younger sister, and the two of them were as close as it is possible for sisters to be, bound together inside the same dazzling, dangerous social world. Harriet married Frederick Ponsonby, Viscount Duncannon and heir to the Earl of Bessborough, tying the Spencer line to yet another great house. She was, like her sister, clever and warm and vulnerable to debt and to the wrong kind of love. And here the story does something that lifts it from scandal into pattern, because Harriet watched everything that happened to Georgiana, watched the exile, watched the silence, watched the cost, and then, years later, she did the very same thing. Her long affair with a younger man produced two children, born in secret and managed by exactly the same machinery of concealment her sister had endured. That is not coincidence. That is inheritance. The younger man was Granville Levison Gower, and he should be understood as the polished beneficiary of the whole system. Charming, well-connected, politically rising, he would in time become the first Earl Granville. He was central to Harriet's life and emotionally entangled with her for decades. But where Harriet bore the cost of their love in her own body and her own reputation, Granville simply went on, accumulating career and standing, structurally cushioned in every way she was not. The intimate correspondence between them survives, and so does the fact of the two children she carried for him in secret. Those two children are the proof that this was a method and not a single accident. The elder was a daughter, Harriet Stuart, born in the summer of 1800 and placed at once with foster parents. The younger was a son, George Stuart. And here the historical record itself becomes part of the story, because it does not treat the two children equally. The daughter survives in the archive in a way that is almost unbearably small and precise. There is a note in the catalogue of a great library that a purse was once said to contain her certificate of birth and baptism. The son fades faster, his early life thinner in the documents, harder to follow. That unevenness is not a gap to be filled with invention. It is itself a finding. It shows what concealment does, not only to a life, but to the memory of a life. Daughters leave certificates folded into purses. Sons can dissolve into an editor's footnote. And surrounding all of them, never to be forgotten, were the children who did count. The legitimate Devonshire children, the official future of the house. They were not bystanders to this story. They were, in the cruelest sense, its instruments. The threat that disciplined Georgiana, that kept her obedient when everything in her wanted to rebel, was the threat of losing access to the children she already had and was permitted to keep. In a dynasty, legitimate and illegitimate children were not two separate worlds. They were one world, sorted by law into the kept and the given away, and the kept were the leverage that ensured the given away stayed gone. That then was the cast, and for a few bright years, before any of the damage showed, it looked less like a tragedy in waiting than like the most enviable family in England. The marriage of 1774 was at first exactly the triumph it had been designed to be. Two of the greatest names in the country were now one. Georgiana arrived at Devonshire House and at Chatsworth as a girl of 16 and was transformed almost instantly into a public figure of the first rank. And for a time, the sheer brilliance of it carried everything along. There were the London seasons, the great rooms lit for politics and flirtation in equal measure, the gaming tables where fortunes and confidences changed hands together. There was Chatsworth in the summers, the house functioning as a kind of dynastic theater, servants moving through the lit rooms, children passing between the nursery and the state apartments, the newspapers treating the Duchess as both a fashion plate and a political force. It was genuinely glamorous and it was genuinely pleasurable, and that matters, because the pleasure is the reason everyone fought so hard later to protect the facade. The facade was worth fortunes. It was also a delightful place to live. The dynasty grew the way dynasties were supposed to. Harriet's marriage to Frederick Ponsonby in 1780 extended the web, binding the Spencers to the Bessborough line and creating the second great branch of this story. Children began to arrive in both households, and yet here, inside the brightness, the first quiet failure was already gathering. Because for years, Georgiana could not produce the one child that actually mattered. She gave the Duke two daughters, and there were losses between them that the records keep only in fragments. The miscarriages and the false hopes that left no monument, because the 18th century did not build monuments to a woman's private grief. The pressure built with each confinement. The unspoken question hanging over every one of them, not whether the child would be healthy or loved, but whether it would at last be a son. The daughters did not secure the line. They could not. Picture the scene replayed in those rooms. The long labor, the relief that the mother had survived, and then the careful, disappointed silence of the people waiting to hear the sex of the child, a silence the mother would have learned to read instantly. It would be 16 years into the marriage before Georgiana finally bore the heir the entire arrangement existed to produce. 16 years of being, in the eyes of the system, not yet finished with her one essential task. There is something almost unendurable in that when you set it beside the woman the public saw, the most celebrated woman in England, dazzling at the center of every room, privately measured and found wanting against a standard that had nothing to do with who she was. And it was into this household, a brilliant marriage with a cold center and an anxious, unfinished succession, that Bess arrived, and at first her arrival felt like relief. She was Georgiana's confidant, her ally, her comfort against the loneliness of a husband who would not be reached. The Duchess loved her, only slowly, and then not at all slowly did it become clear that the comfort and the betrayal were the same person. Bess traveled abroad and bore the Duke, two illegitimate children, and then came back, and the household simply rearranged itself around the fact the way water closes over a stone. The Duke's hidden children were absorbed, provision was made, names were found, distance was arranged, nobody's world ended. And so the arrangement settled into something almost domestic, which was perhaps the strangest part of all. The three of them lived together, the Duke, the Duchess, and the Duchess's dearest friend who was also the Duke's mistress, sharing houses, sharing seasons, traveling together, raising between them a tangle of children born of more than one bed. To the world, it looked like an unusually close household, a duchess blessed with a devoted companion. Inside, it was a quiet, sustained negotiation that nobody discussed aloud, the kind of arrangement that the 18th century was perfectly willing to tolerate so long as the right surfaces were maintained. Georgiana, by every account, suffered inside it and clung to it at the same time, because Bess was both the source of her humiliation and the person who comforted her about it. The household had become a closed system, fluent in the management of secrets, practiced in making inconvenient facts look like ordinary life. That fluency was about to be tested as it never had been before. That is the detail that should hang in the air as this first chapter closes, because it is the hinge on which everything that follows will turn. The house already knew how to do this. The machinery for hiding a child was not invented in a panic when Georgiana fell in love with Charles Grey. It was already running, smoothly, quietly, in the service of the master of the house. The Duke could father children outside his marriage and remain without interruption. The Duke. The question that the next part of this story will answer is the question the household had not yet been forced to ask. What would that same machinery do? How merciful or how merciless would it prove when the body that committed the same offense was not the Duke's but the Duchess's? It would not be merciful. The same household that had quietly folded the Duke's children into the family accounts would, when the time came, treat the Duchess's child as a thing to be removed, renamed, and routed out of the country before it could be loved too long. But to understand how completely the machine turned against her, and how far she would be willing to go to keep loving a child she was forbidden to keep, you first have to watch the love affair begin. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. The love affair began where almost everything in Georgiana's life began, in a crowded, candlelit room full of clever men talking about power. By the 1780s, Devonshire House in Piccadilly had become the beating heart of Whig opposition politics, and Georgiana was its presiding genius. This was not a passive role. In an age when women were not supposed to have politics at all, she had made herself indispensable to a party, gathering its leaders under her roof, smoothing its quarrels, lending it her fame, her charm, and her instinct for people. Charles James Fox, the great rumpled lion of the opposition, was a regular at her table. So was the playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan. So for years, was the Prince of Wales himself, the future George IV, drawn to Devonshire House, as moths are drawn to the brightest thing in the dark. To be admitted to that circle was to be at the center of fashionable, intellectual, oppositional England. And the woman who decided who was admitted was the Duchess. What life looked like in those years and worth dwelling on, because the brightness was real, and the viewer has to feel it before it is taken away. There were the London seasons, the house thrown open night after night, the rooms loud with argument and laughter, and the particular electricity of people who believed they were shaping events. There were the evenings that ran until the candles guttered and the windows grayed with dawn, the talk of elections and the king's madness, and the war that everyone could feel coming, conducted by men who would go on to govern the country, and presided over by a woman in her 20s who could hold the whole room in her hand. There were the gaming tables where faro and hazard ran through the small hours and where reputations and fortunes turned on the fall of a card. Georgiana sat at those tables as the hostess and the player both, and the line between the social and the dangerous for her was always thin. She loved the noise of it, the company, the sense that she was at the center of the only place worth being. There was Chatsworth in the summers, the great house in Derbyshire filling with guests, the long avenues and the famous waterworks and the dinners that stretched the length of the staterooms. There was Chiswick, the exquisite Palladian villa on the western edge of London, where the family gathered in a more intimate key, among the cedars and the classical statuary. And over all of it presided Georgiana's own legend, the gowns that set the fashion for a nation, the towering hair dressed with ostrich feathers, and on at least one famous occasion, a model ship in full sail riding the powdered waves of it. She was copied, caricatured, adored. Women who had never met her arranged their hair to look like hers. It is genuinely difficult to find a modern equivalent. She was, in a country of perhaps 8 million people, one of the half-dozen most recognized faces alive, and she had achieved it not through a throne or a battlefield, but through sheer force of personality. And there was, beneath the public dazzle, a private happiness that was just as real, and it is the part that makes everything afterward hurt. Georgiana adored her children, Whatever else was wrong inside that marriage, she was, by every account, a warm and attentive mother to the daughters she finally bore, and then to the long-awaited son. Not the remote, delegating aristocratic parent of the cliché, but a woman who wrote to her children in a tumble of affection, who fretted over their health and their lessons and their small unhappinesses, who wanted them near her. She had a serious mind, too, that the fashion plates and the caricatures never captured. She read, she wrote, verse, a novel, letters of real intelligence. She took a genuine interest in science and politics and the people around her. The woman the public saw was a confection of feathers and scandal. The woman her family knew was clever, tender, easily wounded, and almost helplessly loving. You have to hold both of those in mind at once because the system that was about to break her did not care about either. It cared only about the line. The very capacities that made her remarkable, her warmth, her need to love and be loved, her refusal to be merely decorative, were precisely the capacities it had no use for and would punish. Her sister moved in the same constellation. Harriet had married Frederick Ponsonby, Viscount Duncannon, in 1780, and was now on her way to becoming Countess of Bessborough, a great Anglo-Irish title, with its own house and its own web of expectation. Where Georgiana blazed, Harriet glowed more quietly. She was the cleverer of the two by some accounts, more bookish, more inward, but no less warm and no less vulnerable to the same temptations. She gambled too and ran into the same kind of debt. She loved too easily and would pay for it in the same currency her sister was about to pay in. The two of them were rarely apart for long, and when they were, they wrote constantly in the intense, confiding, half-coded language of women who understood each other better than anyone else ever would. There is something worth registering in that closeness now, before the story darkens, because the road Georgiana was about to walk would, 8 years later, be walked by Harriet too. The sister who watched it all happen would not be spared by the watching. She would, in time, do the very same thing. It was into this world, sometime around the turn of the decade, that Charles Grey arrived. He was young and born in 1764, which made him 7 years Georgiana's junior. Handsome, serious, fiercely ambitious, a rising Whig who fit perfectly into the Devonshire house circle and who fell completely for the woman at its center, and she fell for him. You have to understand what that meant to a woman in her position. For years, she had been married to a man who offered her courtesy and nothing warmer, a man whose real affection, such as it was, had settled instead on her own closest friend. For years, she had performed the part of the radiant, beloved Duchess, while privately starving for the thing the part was supposed to come with. And then here was Grey, a man who wanted her, particularly urgently, not as a duchess, or a hostess, or an ornament of the Whig cause, but as herself. There is a terrible logic to it. The household she lived in had been engineered, almost from the start, to deny her exactly this. When it finally arrived in the shape of a young man 7 years her junior, she had almost no defenses against it. The affair deepened across the early 1790s, stolen and dangerous, and for a while kept just beneath the surface of a world that saw everything. It was the happiest she had been and the most exposed, and she seems to have half known, even then, that a woman like her could not have such a thing for free. How the affair was conducted in practical terms is mostly lost to us, as these things are meant to be. It would have lived in the spaces a duchess's life left unwatched, the press of a crowded assembly, the cover of a house full of guests, the long Whig evenings when the Duke kept to his cards and his dogs and his own arrangements. It would have lived in letters, the safest and most dangerous medium of the age, written in haste and meant to be burned, and not always burned. Everyone in their world conducted affairs. The unwritten rule was not that one must be faithful, but that one must not be caught in a way that forced the surface to break. For a time, Georgiana and Grey managed it, but she was the most observed woman in England, and he was a rising man whose enemies would have paid well for exactly this, and the same fame that protected her in some ways made her impossible to hide in others. Every week the affair continued. The margin of safety grew thinner, and then it ran out entirely, in the one way that could not be talked around, smoothed over, or denied, because a pregnancy is not a rumor. It is a fact that grows. Because the brightness, by now, was already cracking, and it was cracking first along the line of money. Georgiana's gambling had not slowed. It had metastasized. The debts ran into figures that are difficult to render even now, in tens of thousands of pounds, sums equal to several millions in today's money. And around them she had built an exhausting architecture of secrecy. She borrowed from bankers and from friends, and most dangerously, from men who understood that a duchess in debt was a useful person to have an obligation from, men whose discretion came at a price that was never quite spoken. She lied to the Duke about the extent of it. She lied to her mother. The Countess Spencer, who loved her daughter with that same suffocating intensity she always had, suspected the truth and pressed at it relentlessly, letter after letter, demanding honesty, offering rescue with one hand and judgment with the other. And Georgiana, cornered, lied to her too, because the truth was always larger than the last confession, and she could not bear to watch her mother's face when the full figure was finally named. There is something worth sitting with in the image of the most admired woman in England lying awake over her accounts in the small hours of the morning, terrified, not of poverty, which was unimaginable to her, but of exposure, of the single moment when the careful surface would crack and the disorder underneath would become a fact the world could see. Beneath the debts ran a deeper and quieter grief, and it had a name, and the name was Bess. The arrangement that had settled over Devonshire House, the husband, the wife, and the wife's dearest friend who shared the husband's bed, was not a thing that could be made painless simply by being tolerated. Georgiana lived, day after day, in the same houses as the woman her husband preferred, and she loved that woman, and was betrayed by her, and depended on her all at once, and there was no one she could say this to without it becoming a scandal. By every account, she absorbed it the way she absorbed everything, with charm on the surface and a slow accumulation of damage underneath. The gambling, the frantic sociability, the headlong tumble into gray, these were not separate failings. They were the behavior of a woman trying to feel something sharp enough to cut through the particular numbness of being unwanted in her own home, while the whole country envied her. And that was the true fault line in this household, deeper than any single debt or any single affair. The entire edifice ran on the maintenance of surfaces, and underneath it ran a hierarchy of permitted appetite that everyone obeyed without ever stating it aloud. The Duke could keep a mistress in his own house and father children on her, and the surface held. Georgiana could run up ruinous debts and campaign in the streets and live half her life on the edge of scandal. And as long as the one essential thing, the legitimacy of the line, remained untouched, the surface held there too. But the line ran through her body. That was the asymmetry that had been waiting, quietly, patiently, since the day she married at 16. A man's infidelity was a private matter the system could absorb. A wife's infidelity, if it produced a child, was not a private matter at all. It was an attack on the foundation itself, on the clean and unquestionable descent that the houses and the title and the seat in the lords all depended upon. And Georgiana, by the autumn of 1791, was carrying Charles Grey's child. What happened next is the first fracture, and it deserves to be seen slowly, because it is the moment the machinery of the dynasty turned from tolerance to containment with a speed that must have been terrifying to live through. The precise sequence of conversations has not survived in full. These were not events anyone wished to commit to paper. But the shape of it is clear enough. The pregnancy could not be hidden indefinitely. There would have been the private dawning of it first, the calculation a woman makes alone, the dates counted and recounted, the slow understanding that this was not a thing that charm or money or distance could undo. And then the knowledge spreading outward, in the careful way such knowledge spreads in a great house, from the woman to her intimates to, finally, the one person it could not be kept from. Word reached the Duke. And the Duke, who had tolerated so much, who had himself populated the household with children born outside the marriage bed, found that there was, after all, a line, and that his wife had crossed it. There must have been a stretch of time, weeks perhaps, in which Georgiana knew what was coming and could do nothing but wait for it. This is the part the documents do not record and the imagination cannot avoid. A woman carrying on with the seasons and the dinners and the public performance of being herself, while inside she counted the days and understood, with rising dread, that the surface she had spent her whole life maintaining was about to break in the one place it could not be repaired. She would have known that the Duke would learn of it. She would have known, better than anyone, what the rules of her world prescribed for a wife in her condition. She had watched the household absorb Bess's children. She had no illusions about the difference between the Duke's case and her own. To be the most admired woman in England and to be, at the same time, privately certain of your own ruin, and to have to keep smiling at supper while you wait for the blow to land. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that, and Georgiana lived inside it through the closing months of 1791. The confrontation, when it came, was not a matter of shouting. That was not the Duke's way, and that is precisely what made it so much worse. Picture Devonshire House in the late autumn of 1791. The same great rooms that had hosted half the political talent of England. The fires lit against the cold, the servants moving softly and saying nothing, and somewhere within them a conversation conducted in the low-level, terrible voice of a man laying out terms. The Duke did not need to rage. He held every card, and he knew it, and so did she. He set before Georgiana a choice that was not really a choice at all. She would give up Charles Grey, completely and forever. She would go abroad, quietly, under whatever cover story could be arranged, and she would have the child in secret, far from England, where no one need ever connect it to the House of Devonshire. The child would be given away, and in return for all of that surrender, she would be permitted in time to come home, to keep her place, to keep her position and her income and her social existence, and above all, to keep her children. There it was, the threat at the center of everything, named and laid on the table. Her three legitimate children, little G, who was 8 years old, Harriet, who was 6, and the heir, the boy they called Hart, who was barely more than 1, and were not in this calculation simply her children. They were the leverage. The Duke made it plain, in that level voice, that the alternative to obedience was total. A separation in which she would lose everything, her position, her income, her name, her place in the only world she had ever known, and the 3 children she had borne him and loved beyond anything on earth. She could keep the child she was carrying, or she could keep the 3 she already had. She could not have both. No court would need to be troubled. The law and the custom of the age placed children entirely in the father's power, and the father had spoken. A mother had no claim the law would recognize against him. He was not threatening to do something cruel. He was simply describing the world as it already was and letting her feel the full weight of it. Watch how each person around her responded, because their responses tell you what kind of world this was. Charles Grey, the man she loved, the father of the child, could do nothing. And that impotence is its own quiet tragedy, easy to overlook beside hers. He loved her, by every account, genuinely. There were moments when he seems to have wanted to take her away, to defy the whole order and make some impossible new life with her somewhere beyond its reach. But he was a young politician at the very beginning of his career, embedded in exactly the same aristocratic structure as the Duke, with no fortune of his own to speak of, and no power whatsoever to shield a duchess from her own husband. He could offer her feeling. He could not offer her rescue. And so he did what men in his position did. He stepped back and let her bear it and went on to the long and brilliant public life that waited for him. The very life that would have been impossible had he chosen her. That choice, made by both of them, would shadow the rest of the days. Bess was present through all of it, like in her usual impossible double role. She comforted Georgiana and managed the Duke and made herself, as always, indispensable to both, the one person who could move freely between the wronged wife and the husband who had set the terms. Whether she was a true friend in this crisis or a useful agent of it is a question the surviving record does not fully answer, and perhaps she was both at once, which was the only thing she had ever been. And then there was the Countess Spencer, Georgiana's adored, adoring, relentless mother, and her response is, in some ways, the most quietly devastating of all. She did not, in this crisis, take her daughter's side against the family code. She took the code's side against her daughter. She had spent Georgiana's entire life teaching her what was owed to the name. And now, at the worst hour of that life, she helped enforce the bill. The mother became, in effect, one of the managers of the daughter's disgrace. Present, involved, supervising the arrangements, comforting and policing in the same breath. There is no neater illustration of how total the grip of these expectations was. Even a mother's love bent itself in the end to the shape of the dynasty. And Harriet was there too, watching, her own life still apparently intact, her own secret still years in the future. She watched her sister be handed an ultimatum that amounted to choosing between her children. She saw, up close and in full, exactly how the system handled a woman in this position. The exile, the silence, the surrender, the cover story, the careful machinery of removal. She saw every step of the procedure. She would have reason, 8 years later, to remember all of it when the same machinery closed around her. So Georgiana chose. Of course she chose. Set against the loss of her 3 children, even the child growing inside her could not weigh enough, and she agreed to the terms. To go abroad, to surrender the baby, to give up Grey. It is easy, at a distance of more than 2 centuries, to call that a failure of nerve, to wish she had run, defied them, kept the child, and damned the consequences. It was nothing of the kind. It was a mother being made to amputate one love in order to preserve another, and being told by everyone she trusted that this was the responsible thing, the family thing, the only thing a woman in her position could possibly do. The cruelty of it is not simply that she was forced to choose. The cruelty is that the people doing the forcing, the husband, the mother, even in his helpless way, the lover, genuinely believed they were saving her. The early consequences moved with the cold efficiency of a household that had managed versions of this before. A cover story was assembled, and it was a good one because they were practiced at this. The Duchess was unwell. The Duchess required the gentler climate of the continent. The Duchess would travel abroad for her health, accompanied by family and friends, and would return when she was recovered. It was a respectable fiction, the kind everyone in their world knew how to construct, and more importantly, knew how not to question, and it had the additional advantage of being, in its way, true. She was unwell, in body and in spirit both, and the climate she required was simply one that lay beyond the reach of English gossip. But before she could leave, there was a parting that the cover story could not soften, and it is the detail that makes the whole arrangement land as something other than administration. She had to say goodbye to the 3 children she was doing all of this to keep. Imagine it without melodrama, because the truth needs none. A mother taking leave of a boy, not yet 2, who would not remember her going, of a girl of 6 and a girl of 8, old enough to know that their mother was leaving and not old enough to be told why, embracing them, perhaps, in a nursery at Devonshire House or at Chatsworth, holding the youngest a moment too long, and then handing them back to the people who would raise them in her absence. She did not know how long she would be gone. As it turned out, it would be the better part of 2 years. She was leaving the children she loved in order to keep them, and she was carrying away from them the child she loved and would not be allowed to keep. And there was no version of the leave-taking in which she was not betraying someone. That is the shape of the trap the dynasty had built. It did not give her a clean way to be a good mother. It only gave her ways to lose. In the autumn of 1791, she left England, and she did not leave alone. Bess went with her. Her mother, the Countess Spencer, came too, both as comfort and as supervision, the line between the two by now almost impossible to draw. And for part of the journey, so did Harriet, herself unwell, herself in need of a continental cure. The 2 sisters once again bound together, traveling this time not toward the next brilliant season, but away from everything, into concealment. They moved into a Europe coming apart at the seams. This was France in the throes of revolution, the old order visibly collapsing, the roads uncertain, the news from Paris worse, with every passing week aristocrats fleeing in the opposite direction with whatever they could carry. There is a strange, bleak appropriateness in the timing. The Duchess of Devonshire, fleeing the rigid hierarchy of her own world in order to protect its surfaces, was traveling through a country in the very act of tearing such hierarchies down. But she was in no condition to register the historical irony. She was pregnant, frightened, separated from her children, mourning a man she had been forbidden ever to see again, and moving steadily south through a disintegrating country toward a confinement she would have to endure far from home, under another name, in rooms that did not belong to her. The journey itself was long and joyless, conducted at the pace of horses and bad roads, through a France where the courtesy once shown to a great English lady could no longer be relied upon, and where the wrong word at the wrong barrier could turn dangerous. They moved south by stages, the little party of women, the disgraced Duchess, her watchful mother, her compromised friend, and for a while her ailing sister, stopping where they could, pressing on where they had to, the whole enterprise wrapped in the polite fiction of a health tour. And then there were the months of waiting at the end of it, which may have been the hardest part of all. A confinement does not arrive on schedule. There were weeks to be got through in unfamiliar lodgings, far from everyone she loved, with little to do but feel the child grow and dread what its arrival would mean. Letters came and went slowly and could not be trusted. She could write to her children only in the careful, cheerful, lying tone the cover story demanded, never saying where she truly was or why. She was a woman accustomed to filling every room she entered, reduced now to a patient in borrowed quarters, counting time. By the early weeks of 1792, she had reached the south of France, and the cover story had done its work, and the world she had ruled for nearly 20 years had no idea where she truly was or why. The most famous woman in England had been folded out of sight as neatly as a letter sealed into an envelope. The machinery had engaged at every level: the husband, the mother, the friend, the law, the cover story, the careful distance, the practiced silence. Everything was in place now for the child to arrive and then to be carried away. It is worth pausing on what she had become in that southern winter, because the contrast is the whole point. A few years earlier, she had stood at the center of English public life, the woman whose movements were reported and whose fashions were copied across a nation, the hostess through whose rooms the future government of the country passed. Now she was a patient in a rented house at the far end of France, known to her neighbors, if at all, under some quite borrowed name, waiting in fear for a birth that would end not in celebration, but in surrender. No crowds, no feathers, no politics, only the shuttered light of a foreign room, the slow turning of the days, and the particular stillness that settles over a person who has run out of choices and can do nothing now but wait for the thing she dreads. Around her, the small party kept up the fiction. Inside it, she was rehearsing a goodbye she had not yet been allowed to say. What no one in that southern house could yet know was how completely the vanishing would work, how fast the baby would be taken from her mother's arms once she was born, under what borrowed name she would be sent out into the world, and how long, decades long, the effort to erase her would go on bleeding through the family's letters and the family's silences, long after every person who had arranged it was dead. The exile did not end with her arrival in the South. In some ways, that was when the hardest part began, because arrival meant there was nothing left to do but wait. And waiting was the one thing Georgiana had never been built for. She was a woman who lived through motion and company and the constant low hum of being needed, and now she had been set down in a quiet foreign town with a small party of attendants and a cover story, and the days had to be got through one by one. Her health, never robust, suffered in the strain of it. She was prone to bouts of genuine illness, to the headaches and fevers and nervous collapses that ran through her life, and the pregnancy, the fear, and the isolation made all of it worse. She wrote letters home in the careful, cheerful, lying register the situation demanded, to her children, who must be reassured, to her mother, who already knew everything and required managing, to the few friends permitted to write to her at all. And underneath the cheerful letters ran a fear she could share with almost no one, because childbirth in 1792 was a thing women did not always survive, and she knew it, and she was about to do it far from home, in disgrace, for a child she would not be allowed to keep. There is something worth sitting with in that particular arithmetic. She was risking her life, really literally risking it, the way every woman of the age risked it in childbed, to bring into the world a daughter she had already agreed to give away. The danger was real, and the reward was, by the terms of the bargain, to be taken from her at once. No woman should have to do both of those things in the same act, and yet the system had arranged it so that she must. And the waiting wore at her in ways the cheerful letters never showed. She had been a woman of perpetual motion, and now the days were shapeless and slow, measured out in small foreign rituals. The walk that could be taken without being recognized, the meal eaten in rooms that held nothing of her own, the long evenings with only Bess and her mother and a handful of attendants for company, all of them maintaining the fiction even among themselves. She fretted over her children at home, reading and rereading their short letters, answering them in a tone of breezy maternal calm that must have cost her something close to physical pain to sustain. She thought about Gray, whom she was forbidden to write to or see and whose child she carried. She was, by temperament, a person who needed to be loved and useful and surrounded, and she had been stripped of all three at once and set down in a place chosen precisely because no one there knew who she was. The most observed woman in England had been granted at last the anonymity she had never wanted in the cruelest possible form. But to understand the full coldness of what was being done to her, you have to understand that none of it was improvised. This is the part of the story that turns it from a private tragedy into something closer to a procedure. And it requires going back a few years, into the household itself, to a thing that had already happened more than once under the same roof. Because Georgiana was not the first woman attached to the Devonshires to be quietly taken abroad to give birth in secret. She was simply the first wife. The machinery that was now closing around her had been built, tested, and run smoothly years before, for the Duke. Cast your mind back to the middle of the 1780s, to the early years of the strange three-cornered household, when Bess had become both the Duchess's dearest companion and the Duke's mistress. That arrangement did not stay abstract. In 1785, Bess traveled to the continent, to Italy, away from English eyes, on her own version of the health journey that would later carry Georgiana south. And there she gave birth to a daughter by the Duke. The child was handed almost at once to others to be reared, kept at a careful distance in her first years, and given the name Caroline St. Jules, a surname chosen, like so many in this story, precisely because it pointed nowhere and explained nothing. 3 years later, in 1788, the same thing happened again. Bess went abroad once more and bore the Duke a son, and he was given the name Augustus Clifford. Clifford being an old Cavendish family name, a quiet half acknowledgement that said just enough to those who already knew and nothing at all to those who did not. 2 children, born in foreign rooms, to the master of one of the greatest houses in England, each separated from the mother in infancy, each tucked into the keeping of strangers, and then in time folded, carefully, deniably, back into the life of that house. And here is the detail that should make the hair on your neck rise, given where Georgiana now sat. Bess had endured precisely the ordeal that was about to be inflicted on her friend: the foreign confinement, the secrecy, the surrender of a newborn to other hands. She knew, from the inside, exactly what it was to bear a child in concealment and have it taken away. She had walked every step of the road Georgiana was now walking. The difference was the ending. Bess's children, the Duke's children, would in time be brought home, raised within the family, given a place. That was the mercy the household was capable of when it chose. The question hanging over the southern house was whether it would choose the same mercy now. Picture how that was managed, because it is the template for everything that happened to Georgiana. A woman is removed from England before her condition can be read by anyone who matters. She gives birth somewhere beyond the reach of English society. The child is given a neutral name. Arrangements are made: money, nurses, distance. And then, in time, the children are brought into the family circle and raised there, near the legitimate children, as wards or relations, or simply as the children who were somehow always around. By the time Georgiana sat waiting in the south of France, those 2 children of Bess and the Duke already existed, already had their borrowed names, were already being woven into the texture of the household she had left behind. One of them, the little girl, Caroline St. Jules, then about 6 years old, was even part of the small party that had traveled south. There is a detail worth holding on to. In that quite foreign house, where the Duchess waited to bear and surrender a child she could not keep, there was already living, underfoot, a child the same household had borne and kept, a child of the very triangle that had broken her. The instrument of her isolation and the proof of the double standard were playing in the same rooms. That is what makes the cruelty of Georgiana's case so precise. The household did not panic when she fell pregnant by Gray. It did not have to invent a single thing. It already knew exactly how this was done, because it had done it twice, for the man at the head of the family, without anyone's world ending. The only question that had ever been open was whether the same mercy, the foreign birth, the neutral name, the eventual quiet absorption, would be extended to a child of the Duchess's body, as it had been to children of the Duke's. And the answer, when it came, was that it would not. The Duke's children could be brought home. The Duchess's child could not. Caroline St. Jules would grow up inside the family. Eliza would be sent as far from it as the arrangement could manage. Same machinery, opposite verdicts, and the only variable that had changed was which parent had strayed. To understand why the verdict was so absolute, you have to understand what was actually at stake if the secret broke, because it was not merely embarrassment. A duke's bastard threatened nothing. They had no claim on the title or the great estates, and everyone knew it. But a duchess's child was a different kind of danger entirely. If it became known that the Duchess of Devonshire had borne a child by another man, the question would not stop at her reputation. It would travel inevitably to the nursery, to the boy called Hart, the long-awaited heir, born only 2 years before. If the Duchess could stray once, whispered the logic of the age, who was to say with perfect certainty that the heir himself was the Duke's? The doubt did not have to be true to be ruinous. It only had to be sayable. And a doubt cast on the legitimacy of the heir was a doubt cast on the whole inheritance, on the title, on Chatsworth, on the fortune that the Boyle marriage had nearly doubled, on the seat in the Lords and the place at the center of national life. This was the real reason the machinery closed so hard. The household was not protecting its dignity. It was protecting the line itself, the clean and unquestionable descent on which everything rested. And against that, a single woman's claim to her own daughter weighed nothing at all. And so, while Georgiana was still carrying her, the matter of where the child would go was settled. And this is the second fracture, the cold administrative one, because it is the moment a baby's entire future was disposed of before she had drawn a breath. The decision was not made in the southern house. It was made at a distance, in correspondence, by the people who held the power. The Duke, who set the terms, the Spencers, who managed the practicalities, and Charles Grey's own family, who would in the end take the child in. The plan that emerged had two stages. First, the baby would be handed at once to a foster nurse, separated from her mother in the earliest hours, fed and kept by a stranger in the very period when an infant is supposed to be inseparable from the woman who bore her. This was not, by the standards of the age, regarded as cruelty. Wet nursing and farming out were common enough among the wealthy. But there is a difference between a child sent to a nurse who will return her to a loving home and a child sent to a nurse. Precisely so that the home she was born into can pretend she does not exist. Eliza would be the second kind, and then, when she was old enough to travel, she would be carried across the Channel to England and into the household of Charles Grey's parents in Northumberland at Falodon, to be raised by them as their own. Consider the elegance of that solution from the family's point of view, and the desolation of it from the child's. Grey's parents would raise her, which meant the paternal line could quietly absorb the inconvenience. For among Grey's own people, an extra child was a private matter to be managed, not a duchess's catastrophe to be hidden. She would grow up believing, more or less, that she was a late child of the Grey household, a younger sister to the man who was in fact her father. Her real mother would become, in the official story of her life, a distant grand connection, the Duchess of Devonshire, who took a kindly interest in her, and visited sometimes and sent things, and could never ever be named as what she was, and the surname chosen for her sealed all of it. She was to be called Eliza Courtney. Courtney. A name that pointed at no one, that carried no claim, that gave not the faintest hint of who her father or her mother had been. The scholars who study how these children were named have shown how much such a choice could signal. The standing of the families, the nature of the arrangement, the degree of concealment intended. In Eliza's case, the signal was the absence of a signal. The name was not an identity. It was a door closing. There is something almost unbearable in the fact that this was all arranged in advance. The foster nurse engaged, the eventual home agreed, the name selected, for a person who did not yet exist outside her mother's body, by people who had decided her life would be a managed absence before they had so much as seen her face. Georgiana, in the South, knew the plan. She had agreed to it. She had had no real power to do anything else. She was carrying a daughter whose nurse was already chosen, whose name was already decided, whose home was already fixed hundreds of miles from her own, and she had to sit with that knowledge through the last weeks of the pregnancy, in a borrowed room, waiting. It would be a mistake to imagine that any of this struck the people arranging it as monstrous, and that is precisely what makes it so chilling. They were not doing anything their world regarded as unusual. The sending away of inconvenient children was woven through the whole of Georgian society, top to bottom. At the bottom, the poor surrendered infants to institutions like the Foundling Hospital in London, where a child could be taken in, registered, in effect renamed, and sent out to a wet nurse in the countryside, far from the mother who could not keep it. A whole charitable apparatus built on the principle that the answer to an impossible child was distance. The elite did not use the institutions. They had no need to. They had money and the houses and trusted servants, and so they performed the same operation privately, with better paperwork and softer surroundings, the foreign confinement instead of the public ward, the engaged nurse instead of the parish one, the neutral surname instead of the foundling's number. But the logic was identical, and everyone involved understood it as simply the way such things were done. Georgiana's tragedy was not that her family invented a cruelty. It was that her family applied to a duchess's daughter the same machinery the entire society reserved for children who could not be allowed to exist where they had been made. Now follow the threads outward, because the people who had set this in motion were not suffering as she was, and the contrast is the point. Charles Grey, the father, was in England, and his life was opening, not closing. He was a young man with a great political career ahead of him, and that career required exactly the respectability that openly claiming Georgiana and the child would have destroyed. So he did not claim them. He let his parents take the baby. He let the cover story stand. He turned toward the public life that the silence made possible. It would be easy to despise him for it, and the script should resist the easy version, because the truth is sadder. He seems to have felt the loss genuinely and carried it. He simply also accepted, as everyone in his world accepted, that a man's future was worth more than a woman's claim or a child's name. He would go on to marry, to have a large, legitimate family, to rise and rise eventually to the very summit of British politics. The man who could not afford to claim his own daughter would 4 decades later stand as Prime Minister and carry the Great Reform Act of 1832, the law that began to widen the British franchise, that made the country marginally more just, and his name would attach itself to a blend of tea and outlive all his politics in the nation's kitchens. He would be remembered as a reformer, a man who enlarged other people's rights. The one right he never found a way to extend was the right of his first daughter to bear his name. The child given his blood and denied his name would watch that ascent from the outside, a Courtney looking in, knowing the truth and forbidden ever to say it. The Duke, meanwhile, simply continued to be the Duke. He had set the terms. The terms were being met. There was nothing further for him to do but wait for his wife to complete her penance and come home, chastened and useful again. He had lost nothing. His position was secure, his line was protected, his own 2 children by Bess were thriving under his roof, and the wife who had embarrassed him was conveniently abroad. The fraudeur that had defined him from the start served him perfectly now. A more passionate man might have raged himself into some rash, exposing act. The Duke felt little enough that he could simply manage the situation and move on, and in this world, the capacity to feel little was a kind of power. He went shooting, he played cards. He attended to the estate and the politics and the slow rhythms of a life that had not been interrupted in any way that mattered. Somewhere in France, his wife was risking her life to bear and surrender a child, and the man whose terms had sent her there carried on with his autumn and his winter as though nothing of consequence were happening, because to him, in truth, nothing of consequence was. The line was safe. That was all that had ever been at issue. There is a particular horror in being destroyed by someone for whom your destruction is merely tidy, and Georgiana was learning it in the most thorough way a person can. Bess occupied, as ever, the most tangled position of anyone. She was in the south with Georgiana, the loyal friend at the bedside of the woman she had wronged for a decade, comforting her, no doubt sincerely, while embodying everything that had made Georgiana's marriage a desert. Her own 2 children by the Duke were the living evidence that she had walked this exact road and been forgiven, kept, absorbed. Whether she felt the irony of it, whether she sat with Georgiana in those rooms and registered that she herself had been given the mercy now being withheld from her friend, we cannot fully know. Bess was always opaque, always surviving, always indispensable to both sides of every arrangement she was caught in. She is the figure in this story it is hardest to judge and hardest to like, and the fairest thing to say is that she was a woman with almost no power of her own, who had learned to live by being necessary to people who had a great deal, and that such a life does not leave much room for clean choices. If she comforted Georgiana in the South with one part of herself while serving the household's purposes with another, that was simply the shape every relationship in her life had taken. She had survived this long by being on every side at once, and asking nothing of any of them but a place to stand. She would survive a great deal longer the same way. The Countess Spencer, Georgiana's mother, was the manager of the whole affair, and her thread is the quietest heartbreak in this section. She loved her daughter ferociously, and that was never in doubt, and she spent the exile attending to her, supervising the arrangements, smoothing the practicalities present at the worst of it, but she had also all her life been the chief instructor in the very code that was now destroying Georgiana, and she did not waver from it when it counted. She believed genuinely that what was being done was right, that a woman in her daughter's position must submit, must surrender, must protect the name and the legitimate children above all else. Her love and her loyalty to the code were not in conflict in her own mind. They were the same thing. That is the most chilling part. The person who loved Georgiana most was also the person most thoroughly convinced that the system breaking her was correct. And the 3 children in England, little G, Harriet, and small Heart, were living through their own version of the story without understanding it. Their mother had gone abroad for her health and had not come back. The eldest, 8 years old, was old enough to feel the absence and to write to her. The youngest would have no memory of her leaving at all. They were the prize at the center of the whole bargain, the reason their mother had agreed to give away their half-sister, and they knew none of it. They were being raised in her absence, in a household that contained their father, Their mother's friend, who was their father's mistress, and that friend's two children by their father. A domestic arrangement of bewildering complexity that the adults around them maintained with perfect surface calm. Whatever those children absorbed, in the wordless way children absorb the emotional weather of a house, they absorbed it young. It is worth pausing on the letters that crossed Europe in those months because they are the closest thing we have to a record of what the silence cost. Every line Georgiana wrote had to be composed twice over in her mind, once as she felt it and once as it had to appear. To her children, she had to be a recovering invalid, fond and reassuring, saying nothing true. To her mother, she had to be a penitent daughter, grateful for management she had not chosen. To the wider world, she could write nothing at all that touched the truth. She was a brilliant correspondent, one of the great letter writers of her age, and she was reduced to using that gift to maintain a fiction about her own life. Somewhere in that gap, between the woman writing and the woman the letters described, the real cost of the exile lived. The performance of cheerfulness was not a relief from the ordeal. It was part of the ordeal. There was no one she could tell the whole of it to, except perhaps the sister sitting near her, who was taking it all in. There remained one thread not yet fully in motion, and it is the one that turns this from a single tragedy into a pattern. Harriet, Lady Bessborough now, Georgiana's beloved sister, who had traveled part of the way south with her and watched the machinery engage, was still, at this point, a woman whose own secrets lay ahead of her. She had seen everything. She had watched her sister be given the choice between her children, watched her hauled abroad under a fiction, watched the family settle a baby's fate as if it were a question of moving furniture. She had every reason to recoil from it, to vow that whatever befell her, she would never let herself be processed by the same machine. And yet, within the decade, Harriet would fall into a long love affair with a younger man, and that affair would produce children. And those children would be born in secret and handed to foster parents and raised under a name that hid them. The same exile, the same silence, the same neutral surnames, the same managed absence. The sister who watched would become the sister who repeated. It is one of the strangest and saddest facts in the whole saga, and it tells you something about how these patterns work that no single tragedy could. That even watching the machinery destroy someone you love, up close, in full, does not necessarily inoculate you against it, because the machinery is not a villain you can refuse to deal with. It is the water the whole world swims in, and when your own turn comes, you find that the same rules apply to you and the same options narrow around you, and you make the same surrenders for the same reasons. But that was years off, and lay on the far side of everything that was about to happen in the South, and for now Harriet was simply a frightened woman, keeping her sister company at the edge of the world, with no idea that she was studying her own future. Through all of it, the two sisters had each other, and that bond is the one source of warmth in this cold stretch of the story. They had been close their whole lives, closer than either was to anyone else, and now they were thrown together at the far edge of the world with a secret neither could speak aloud to a soul beyond their own small party. There is a particular intimacy that comes of shared exile, of being the only two people in a foreign room who fully understand why you are there. They comforted each other, they distracted each other. Harriet, herself unwell, herself frightened, held her sister's hand through the worst of the waiting, and in doing so she was, without either of them knowing it, receiving an education, learning step by step, in the most intimate possible way, exactly how a woman of their world was unmade when she loved the wrong person and could not hide the result. It was the cruelest kind of lesson, taught by love, and it would lie dormant in her for years until the day she needed it and found, to her sorrow, that she had learned it perfectly. By the middle of February in 1792, all the threads had drawn tight. The cover story was holding, the foster nurse was waiting, the name was chosen. The home in Northumberland was agreed. Charles Grey was in England building the life the silence would buy him. The Duke was at home, untouched. Bess was at the bedside, indispensable and unreadable. The Countess Spencer was managing. The three children were waiting in houses that no longer contained their mother. And Harriet was close by, watching a future she could not yet see. Everything that human planning could arrange had been arranged. The whole vast apparatus of one of England's greatest families had been turned, for these few weeks, to the single task of making one small life disappear cleanly into the world. And it had worked. There was, by now, no thread left loose, no contingency unprepared for, no person who did not understand their part. There was only one thing left that no planning could control, and it was coming now in a matter of days: the child herself. The actual arrival of the daughter at the center of all this careful, bloodless arrangement, the one event that would turn the correspondence and the cover stories and the chosen names into something with a heartbeat and a weight and a face and a pair of eyes that would open and find, in the first hours of her life, not her mother's face above her, but a stranger's. Georgiana had agreed to all of it. She had had no choice. But agreeing to give away a child you have not yet met is one thing, doing it with the child in your arms is another, and that test was almost upon her. The last days before birth have a quality all their own, a suspended, swollen quiet, and in that southern house the quiet was thicker than usual because no one in it could say aloud what they were waiting for. The household kept its rhythms, meals were served and cleared, the fires were tended against the damp of a southern winter that was milder than England's but not warm, the kind of gray in-between season that has none of the drama of real cold. Bess moved through the rooms with her particular competence. The Countess Spencer wrote her letters and managed her arrangements. A midwife or an accoucheur had been engaged quietly, the way everything in this enterprise was done quietly. A professional brought in who could be trusted to attend a lady whose name was not to be spoken outside these walls. And at the center of it all was Georgiana, large now and slow and frightened, moving less, resting more, waiting for her body to begin the work that would end in the loss she had been promising herself for months she could bear. There is a cruelty in the ordinariness of those days that is worth dwelling on, because it is the ordinariness that makes the thing land. This was not a Gothic confinement in a ruined tower. It was a comfortable house, with servants and meals and a fire, in a pleasant part of France, attended by people who loved her. From the outside, had anyone been permitted to see it, it would have looked like exactly what the cover story claimed, a great lady, unwell, recuperating abroad among her family. The horror was not in the surroundings. The horror was entirely interior, in what every person in that comfortable house knew was going to happen and was helping to arrange, behind the perfectly normal surface of a winter spent in the South. That is the signature of this whole story, and it reaches its purest form here, not a brutality you can point to, not a blow or a cell or a chain, but a catastrophe carried out through perfectly polite means, by kind people in pleasant rooms, with everyone's full cooperation. The cruelty wore the clothes of care. It always did in this family, and it always would. And there was a particular figure moving through those rooms whose presence sharpened everything, though no one would have remarked on it. Caroline St. Jewel, the little girl of 6 or 7, the Duke's daughter by Bess, born in concealment as this new child was about to be, was part of the traveling party. She would have played in the same rooms, eaten at the same table, been a child among the adults the way children are, oblivious to the weight of where she stood in the story. Think about what she represented simply by being there. She was proof of life. She was a child who had been born exactly as Eliza was about to be born, in secret, abroad, to a parent of this household, and who had not been sent to the far end of the country to be raised by strangers, but had been kept, brought along, folded into the family's travels. She was the mercy made flesh. And she was playing in the rooms of a house where that same mercy was even now being withheld from another child, for no reason except which parent had erred. If Georgiana watched that little girl in those last days, how could she not have? She watched the living answer to the question she could not stop asking. Why her child and not mine? The waiting wore differently on each of them. Georgiana, by every indication, was terrified. Not theatrically, but in the deep, practical way of a woman who knew the real odds of childbed in her century and was facing them far from home, exhausted in body and spirit, with nothing certain ahead of her, but loss, whether she lived or died. She had carried 3 children to term before. She knew exactly what was coming, and that knowledge was its own torment, because there was no comfort of ignorance left to her. Her body had grown heavy and slow. She tired easily. The headaches and low fever that plagued her all her life pressed in harder now. She had said her goodbyes to the children in England months before. She had given up the man she loved. She had agreed to give up the child she was carrying. There was, in a sense, nothing left for her to lose except her life, and she may have half believed she would lose that too. The room where it would happen had been made ready in the discreet way such rooms are made ready. The linens, the basins, the things a midwife needs, set out and waiting, the small grim furniture of a birth that could go either way. Bess, for her part, kept up the work of comfort and management, the only role she had ever been allowed. The friend Bess was also the agent, sitting with Georgiana through the long evenings, reading to her perhaps, talking of anything but the thing ahead. And the Countess Spencer waited with the particular tension of a mother who loves her child and has decided against every natural instinct that the right thing is to help take that child's baby away. A woman braced to be strong in a direction her heart did not point, holding herself together by an act of the will so that her daughter would not see her break. What none of them said in those last days was the thing they were all thinking. They did not discuss the plan aloud, the nurse, the journey, the name, the home in Northumberland. It had all been settled. There was nothing to discuss, and to speak of it now would only have made unbearable a thing they were managing by not speaking of it. So they talked of other matters. They talked of the children's letters and the news from England, and the slow, terrible business of the revolution unfolding around them. There was, in fact, a whole world coming apart just beyond the walls of that comfortable house. France in 1792 was a country sliding toward the terror, the monarchy months from collapse, the roads thick with rumor and danger, aristocrats fleeing for their lives in every direction. A great convulsion of history was happening all around this small private drama, and the irony of it would not have been lost on a woman as sharp as Georgiana, had she had the strength to attend to it. That she had been sent here, to a country tearing down its own hierarchy of birth and blood, precisely in order to protect the hierarchy of birth and blood she had been born into. But she could not attend to it. The revolution was background noise to a grief that filled the whole foreground of her life. They talked of everything except the only thing that mattered. And the silence between the words was where the whole weight of it lived. That is a very British way to face a catastrophe. And these were people raised to it from birth, to feel everything and say nothing, to let propriety carry what the heart could not. There is one more thing worth saying about those final days, because it is the part that is easiest to forget across 2 centuries, the sheer physical fear at the center of it. We have grown so used to childbirth as a survivable event that it takes an act of imagination to feel what it meant in 1792. Women died. They died of the labor itself, of the bleeding that followed, of the fevers that came in the days after, and they died in every rank of society. The Duchess no safer in her good house than the laborer's wife in her cottage. Georgiana knew this with the particular clarity of a woman who had survived it 3 times already and understood that survival was never guaranteed. So the dread she carried in those last days was double. There was the grief she knew was coming, the certain loss of the child, and underneath it the cold of fear that she might not survive to grieve at all, that she might die in the foreign room, far from her children, with her last act on earth being the production of a baby she would never see grow. She had, by some accounts, half arranged her affairs against exactly that possibility, the way a frightened person does. She was a woman preparing at 34 for the real chance of her own death, and trying at the same time to summon the strength for an ordeal that would, even at its most successful, end in being robbed. And then the waiting ended the way it always does, not on a schedule anyone chose, but in the body's own time. On or about the 20th of February, in 1792, Georgiana went into labor. We have very little of the detail of it, and that absence is itself a kind of testimony, because the people who could have recorded it had every reason not to. What we know is the shape. The labor came, it was attended, and it was, like all labors of the age, a thing endured rather than managed. Hours of it in a room lit by candle and firelight. The midwife or the accoucheur doing what little the medicine of the time allowed. Bess and the Countess somewhere near. The ordinary, frightening animal work of a body trying to bring a life into the world, without the help of anything we would now recognize as care. There was no relief for the pain. There was no certainty of survival. There was only the long, hard passage that women of every rank made alone. In the end, however many attendants stood in the room. And Georgiana, who had feared she would die, did not die. She came through the one part of the ordeal that might have killed her and was delivered in a rented room in the south of France, far from every home she had ever known, of a living daughter, a girl. After everything, after the years of pressure to bear the Duke a son, after the daughters who had not been enough, after the long-awaited heir who had come at last and secured the line, this final child, the one she would not be allowed to keep, was a girl. There is no way to know what passed through her in the moment she was told, but it is not difficult to imagine the particular ache of it, that the child she could love freely, the child of the man she had actually loved, was a daughter, a small girl who would grow up to be exactly the kind of woman this whole system was built to break, and who would do it without ever knowing whose daughter she truly was. The line had its heir already, safe in England. This girl threatened nothing and secured nothing. She was, in the brutal accounting of the Dynasty, surplus, a child who existed for no reason the system could use, and so a child the system had no use for. She named her Eliza. Even that small act was a mother's claim, the one claim she was permitted before the larger claim was taken from her. The right to choose at least what her daughter would be called in the first hours before the surname that he her was fixed to it. In those first hours, before the machinery could fully engage, there was a window, there always is, in which Georgiana was simply a mother with her newborn daughter. She held her. She looked at her face, searching it the way every mother searches a new face for the features of the people who made it, for something of gray in her, perhaps, or something of herself. She would have felt the weight of her, the particular heat of a newborn, the grip of the small hand. This is the ordinary miracle that has happened in every birth there has ever been, and it happened here too, in a borrowed room at the end of France, to a woman who had been told she could not keep it. We should let that moment stand without reaching for it too hard, because its power is in its plainness. A woman who was, by the law and custom of her world, in the act of committing an unforgivable crime, held in her arms the evidence of that crime, and the evidence was a baby, warm and new and entirely innocent, who knew nothing of dukes or titles or the doctrine of legitimate descent, who knew only the particular warmth and smell and heartbeat of the person holding her, and who turned toward that person the way every newborn does, in total trust, having no idea that the arms holding her had already agreed to let her go. For a few hours, in that room, Georgiana had her daughter. It was the most she would ever be allowed to have of her, freely. And she knew it even as it was happening, which is the cruelest thing of all. To hold your child for the first time and to be counting already the hours until she is taken. Because the plan did not pause for the birth. The nurse had been engaged, the arrangement was fixed. And so, in the early days of Eliza's life, the very days when, in any ordinary circumstance, mother and infant are inseparable, when the whole of nature bends them toward each other, when a mother's body itself is preparing to feed and hold and not let go, the child was taken from Georgiana and given over to a foster mother to be reared. There was no scene, as far as we know, no struggle, nothing that would have disturbed the surface. That was the entire point of how it had been arranged. It was done the way everything in this story was done, quietly, competently, with the full cooperation of everyone present, including, because she had agreed to it, including the mother herself. Picture only the plainest version of it, because the plainest version is the worst. A woman, days out from giving birth, still bleeding, still weak, handing a small wrapped bundle to a stranger. A few words exchanged, practical ones, about feeding and care. The stranger turning and carrying the bundle toward the door, and the woman in the bed, not crying out, not reaching after her because she had promised she would not, because the whole survival of her other children depended on her not making a scene, composing her face instead, as she had been raised since girlhood to compose her face, while the single most important thing in the room was carried out of it. She was expected to recover her health and recover her composure, and in time return to England as though she had merely been unwell. Sit for a moment in the stillness right after, the room after the child is gone, the bed, the spent and exhausted woman in it, the attendants moving softly, the ordinary daylight of an ordinary southern morning coming through the shutters as if nothing has happened, because to the world outside, nothing has. No bells, no announcement, no congratulations carried to England, no heir presented, no celebration of the kind that had attended the birth of little Hart 2 years before, when the whole house had rejoiced and the news had run through the family like light. A child of one of the greatest houses in the country had been born, and the correct response? The arranged response? The only permitted response was silence. The most famous woman in England had just given birth, and not a soul beyond that room was to know it had occurred. There is a particular desolation in a silence like that, not the silence of peace, but the silence of a thing being actively unmade, in real time, by everyone in a position to speak. Every person who could have shouted the news from a rooftop instead lowered their voice. And the room itself, which a day before had held 2 heartbeats, now held 1, and would go on holding 1, and the woman in the bed had to lie there and feel the difference and give no sign of feeling it. Watch, in that stillness, how each of them carried it. Georgiana carried it inward, as she carried everything, and it left a mark on her that never fully healed. For the rest of her life, she would love this lost daughter from a distance, and find ways to see her, and never once be allowed to claim her. Bess carried it with her usual opacity, doing what needed doing. The competent friend, whatever she felt, kept where she kept everything. though she, of all of them, knew most exactly what Georgiana was feeling, having felt it twice herself. The Countess Spencer carried it as a duty discharge, relieved perhaps that the dangerous thing was now safely managed, grieving for her daughter and certain, still, that this had been the only course. She would never, to the end of her days, conclude that she had been wrong. And far away in England, the two men who had made it necessary carried it not at all, or barely. The Duke went on as the Duke, a problem now solved, an inconvenience filed away, his line secure and his routine undisturbed. And Charles Grey, who had loved her, who had fathered this child, turned toward the public life that the silence had purchased, and would in time receive his daughter into his own parents' house and watch her grow as a kind of sister, loving her in this sidelong, deniable way that was the only way left open to him. That was the final symmetry of it. Every adult who loved this child was permitted to love her only sidelong, only deniably, and never by her right name. The men were spared even the grief. The women paid it in full. And the child, who had done nothing at all, would pay it for the rest of her life in a single missing word, the word for who her mother was. Some weeks after the birth, when Georgiana had recovered enough to take up a pen, she wrote a poem about the daughter she had lost. It survives, and it should be touched only lightly, because it says more in a few words than any narration could. In it, she imagines herself not as a mother who can be acknowledged, but as a nameless mother, a hand unseen, a presence that can shape and provide and watch over a child from the shadows, but can never step into the light and say the word that every mother has the right to say. That was the exact and permanent shape of what had been done to her. She was not forbidden to love Eliza. Love was permitted. She was forbidden only to be her mother out loud. She could be a hand unseen. She could not be a name. And she would carry those lines and the truth behind them for the 14 years of life she had left. The immediate aftermath, then, was not the kind that follows most tragedies. There was no rush of arrivals, no crisis to be managed, no world breaking in, because the entire achievement of the operation was that nothing broke in at all. The first days were given over to the ordinary, brutal business of recovery from childbirth, in a body that had been pushed to its limits by fear and grief as much as by labor. A woman recovering from a birth in that age was vulnerable to fever, to infection, to the slow bleeding that carried off so many. And she was recovering not in the comfort of her own home, surrounded by her own people and the new child she had labored to produce, but in a rented house far away with the child already gone, with nothing to show for the ordeal but an empty body and a secret. The natural order of things, in which the pain of birth is answered by the presence of the baby, had been deliberately broken. Her body, by every cruel biological design, was readying itself to nurse and tend an infant who was no longer there. There is a specific desolation in that physical fact that no arrangement could soften, and that no one in the house could acknowledge aloud. The child, with her nurse, began the separate life that had been designed for her. The cover story held perfectly. The news that reached England was only that the Duchess had been unwell and was mending, and Georgiana began the long, strange work of becoming again the woman she had been before, or rather of impersonating that woman, since the one who had gone into that southern room and the one who came out of it were not, underneath the performance, the same person at all. There would be no quick return. She remained abroad for many more months, drifting through a continent at war with itself, moving from place to place, into Italy, among the spas and the cities where displaced English travelers gathered, not permitted to come home until the family judged that enough time had passed for the cover story to have done its work and for her presence in England to provoke no questions. She would not set foot in her own country again for the better part of 2 years. Imagine the strangeness of that long, enforced wandering. A woman who had been the center of London, moving anonymously through foreign towns, writing her careful letters home, marking the seasons pass, knowing that somewhere to the north of her a tiny daughter was growing in the keeping of strangers and would soon be carried to England to be raised by people who were not her parents, and that she herself could not go to her, could not see her, could do nothing but wait out her sentence. When she finally did return, it would be to the same houses, the same husband, the same triangular household with Bess still installed at its center, the same 3 children who had grown without her, and the same vast machinery of appearance that had to be kept running every single day. She would slip back into her life as though she had only been away taking the waters. The performance would resume, the surface would hold, and here is the thing that makes the aftermath of this particular tragedy so unlike a clean ending. The loss did not resolve because the child did not die. Eliza lived. She grew up in Northumberland in the Grey household, a healthy girl who believed for years that she was something other than what she was. And so Georgiana was condemned not to grief, which at least has a shape and an end, but to something stranger and more lasting, to a permanent, low, unhealing ache of a daughter alive and reachable and forbidden. She found ways over the years to see the child. She would visit in the guise of the great relation, taking a kindly interest, and hold herself at the exact distance the fiction required, and look at her own daughter across a room and say nothing true. She could be present, she could not be claimed. She had become, precisely and permanently, the nameless mother of her own poem, the hand unseen, allowed to shape and provide and watch, never allowed to be the word a child says first and most easily in the world. There were others who knew, of course, because a secret of this magnitude is never kept by the principals alone. It is kept by servants, by the maids and nurses and retainers who move through the private spaces of great houses and see what the family would rather not be seen, who carry the letters, who attend the confinements, who know which rooms not to enter and which subjects not to raise. Some of them appear faintly at the edges of the surviving papers, names attached to letters, figures in the background of the correspondence, the human circuitry through which a secret of this kind actually traveled and was actually kept. They are a reminder that the silence was not a single decision, but a daily, collective labor, performed by dozens of people, most of whom have left no other trace. A great family's discretion was built on the discretion of the people who served it, and those people kept faith, by and large, and took what they knew to their graves. What the surface concealed was a wound that would never close, and a secret that would not stay buried as neatly as everyone hoped, because secrets of this kind have a way of leaving traces, in letters that should have been burned and were not, in the memories of servants who knew more than they said, in the small, telling silences of a family that had something to hide. The child had been sent away, the story had been arranged. But the arranging was not in fact over. It would go on for decades, long after Georgiana was in her grave, and the next hands to take up the work of erasure would not be a frightened mothers at all, but a careful descendants, sitting at a desk at Chatsworth with a pen and a will to make their record cleaner than the life had been. They would go through the family's letters and find the places where the lost daughter's name appeared, and they would take a pen to those places and black them out line by line so that the official memory of the family could be tidier than the truth. The dynasty had separated mother and child in life. It would try, generations later, to separate them in memory too. But all of that lay decades ahead. For now, there was only a tired woman in a southern house, recovering her strength for a journey home she did not want to make, to a life she would have to perform for the rest of her days. She had 13, 14 years of life left in her, and she would spend them as she had spent the years before. Dazzling in public, breaking quietly in private, loving a daughter she could never name and 3 children she could never fully tell the truth to. Inside a marriage that had never been a marriage in any sense that warmed her. And she did all of it without ever knowing the final cruelty the story held in store, the one she would not live to see, that her own beloved sister, the woman who had held her hand through the worst of it, was about to walk the very same road. Because it was not the only branch of this family that would need the silence. Because the sister who had sat at Georgiana's bedside, watching, learning, was about to need it for herself. And the pattern that had broken one Spencer daughter was about to prove it could break another. It began, as Georgiana's had begun, with love arriving where it was least permitted. Sometime in the middle of the 1790s, not long after she had returned from nursing her sister through the worst ordeal of her life, Harriet, Lady Bessborough, Georgiana's cleverer, quieter sister, fell into a love affair of her own. The man was Granville Levison Gower, and he was young enough to be a kind of warning in himself. Born in 1773, he was a dozen years her junior. Handsome, ambitious, charming in the easy way of men who have never had to fight for anything. A rising figure in politics and diplomacy with the whole of a brilliant career ahead of him. Harriet was a married woman, the wife of an earl, a mother, a pillar of the same society that had broken her sister. By any measure, she had more to lose than almost anyone, and less excuse than anyone for not seeing exactly where the road led, because she had walked beside her sister to the end of it, and she fell for Granville completely, and the affair lasted in one form or another for the better part of 2 decades. Through her sister's last years, through Georgiana's death, on into the new century, a long, secret, consuming attachment between an older married woman and the younger man she could never be seen to want. It was the central fact of her emotional life, and it had to be lived almost entirely in the dark. You already know the shape of what came next, because you have watched it once before. That is the entire horror of it. Harriet had stood in the rented rooms of the south of France. She had held her sister's hand. She had watched, step by step, in the most intimate possible way, exactly how the machinery worked: the secret pregnancy, the cover story, the foreign confinement, the surrendered child, the neutral surname, the lifetime of loving from a distance. She had every reason on earth to recognize the trap and refuse it. And when her own turn came, she found that recognizing the trap and escaping it were two entirely different things. Because the trap was not a single villain or a single bad decision. It was the whole architecture of her world, and it closed around her exactly as it had closed around Georgiana. In the summer of 1800, Harriet bore Granville a daughter, in secret. By then, the affair was already years old, and it had the same impossible architecture Georgiana's had. A married woman of rank, a younger man with everything to gain from discretion, a love that could be felt freely and acknowledged never. Harriet was, if anything, more clear-eyed than her sister had been. She was the bookish one, the analytical one, the sister who saw things plainly. And it made no difference at all. Seeing the trap with perfect clarity did not lift her out of it. She loved Granville, and she could not have him openly. And when the children came, there was only one thing to be done with them, because there had only ever been one thing to be done with such children, and she had watched it done. The child was given the name Harriet Stuart. Stuart, like St. Jules, like Courtney, like Clifford. A surname that pointed nowhere and explained nothing. The same instrument of concealment the family had now used across 2 generations and 3 branches. And the baby was handed, in the earliest days of her life, to foster parents, to be raised away from the mother who had borne her. A second child followed, a son, George Stuart. And he too was born into the same arrangement of secrecy and distance. 2 more children, hidden, fostered, renamed. The sister who had watched had become the sister who repeated, precisely and completely down to the smallest details of the method. There is a single object that holds the whole weight of this repetition, and it sits today in a great London library, and it is almost unbearably small. Among the surviving papers, there is a note that the little girl's certificate of birth and baptism was once kept in a purse, a small purse, the kind a person carries, into which someone folded the one document that proved the child had been born at all, and where she had been christened, and to whom. Think about what it means that a daughter's entire legal existence could be reduced to a single sheet of paper, hidden in a purse, carried in secret, because it could not be allowed to sit openly in the family records where such things belonged. A legitimate child's birth was an event, announced, registered, celebrated, entered into the great books of the family as a matter of pride. This child's birth was a thing to be concealed about one's person, the proof of her kept close and out of sight, like a guilty letter or a stolen jewel. That is what concealment does to a life. It does not erase the child. Harriet Stuart was real, she lived, she had a certificate, but it makes her existence portable, deniable, something to be tucked away and produced only when absolutely necessary, and only to the right person. A legitimate child's birth was proclaimed from the rooftops. This child's birth was folded into a purse and held against the body of someone who could not afford to be caught holding it. And here the historical record does something cruel and revealing, something worth sitting with, because it shows you the long reach of all this silence. The daughter, Harriet Stuart, leaves a clearer trace than the son. We know more of her: the certificate, the purse, the fact of her fostering. The boy, George Stuart, fades faster into the gaps, his early life thinner in the documents, harder to follow across the years. That unevenness is not an accident of record-keeping. It is the signature of concealment itself, working differently on a daughter than on a son. And it is a reminder that everything we can say about these hidden children, we can say only because something survived that was meant to be destroyed. For every trace that remains, others were burned, or never written, or blacked out later by a careful hand. The children who were hidden well enough have no story at all. We know about these because the hiding was, in the end, imperfect. So the pattern was not a single tragedy. It was a method used and reused, and the proof is that the 2 people who loved each other most in this whole story, Georgiana and Harriet, the 2 Spencer sisters, both walked the identical road, 8 years apart, into the identical silence. one mother sent to the south of France, the other delivering in secret at home. One daughter named Courtney, another named Stuart. One certificate blacked out of the Chatswood letters, another folded into a purse. The family did not learn from Georgiana's suffering that the system was cruel. It learned only that the system worked, and it ran it again. That is perhaps the single hardest truth in the whole story, and it is worth refusing to soften. We tend to believe that suffering teaches, that watching someone we love be destroyed by something will make us turn away from that thing forever. Harriet is the proof that it does not always work that way, that a pattern strong enough, woven deep enough into the fabric of a world, can survive even the full, intimate, first-hand knowledge of what it costs. She had seen everything. She knew exactly what she was walking into. And she walked into it anyway, not because she was foolish or weak, but because the alternatives the world offered her were the same alternatives it had offered her sister, which is to say none. The lesson the Spencer sisters were taught across 2 generations was not that the silence could be broken. It was that the silence was the only thing that worked, and that a woman who loved the wrong person had better learn to live inside it. They both learned it, they both paid for it, and they both kept it faithfully to the end of their lives. Against all of that, the later years of Georgiana's own life have a quality of quiet endurance. She came home to England in the autumn of 1793, slipped back into her place, and resumed the performance. The politics, the society, the role of the great Duchess, carrying inside her the daughter she could not name. The debts went on mounting. She never escaped them, juggling enormous sums to the end of her life, the secret arithmetic that had terrified her in her 20s pursuing her into middle age. The triangular household went on too, Bess still installed, the strange domestic peace maintained, and she went on loving Eliza in the only manner permitted to her. Over the years, she found her ways. She would arrange to see the child, who was being raised as a Grey, presenting herself as the great relation taking a kindly interest, and she would sit in a room with her own daughter and hold the whole truth behind her teeth. There are few situations a person can be placed in more quietly agonizing than that. To look at your own child across a room, healthy and growing and real, and to be permitted every courtesy except the one that matters, the simple naming of what you are to each other. She did it for years. She did it well enough that the surface never broke. And then, in 1796, the woman whose face had been the most famous in England suffered an ordeal that took even that from her. A violent infection settled in one of her eyes. The treatments of the age were brutal and largely useless. The eye was subjected to procedures that read now like torture, and for a time it was feared she would die. When she survived, she was left disfigured, the sight in the eye largely gone, the celebrated beauty marred past recovery. The woman who had been copied and caricatured and adored for her looks had to go on living in public without them, knowing that the faces she met were registering the change. She bore it by every account with more grace than the world had any right to expect. And she remained, even disfigured, even aging, even buried in debt, a person people loved to be near. But there is something terribly apt in it, that the system, which had reduced her to a hidden patient, should in the end take her beauty too, as if to complete the work of stripping away everything she had been admired for, and leaving only the person underneath, whom her world had never properly valued in the first place. She died on the 30th of March, in 1806, at Devonshire House, after a short and agonizing illness at the age of 48. The end was painful and came quickly. Those around her, the Duke and Bess, and her children among them, watched her go in a matter of days. She had been the most famous woman in England. She died exhausted, in pain, mourned across the country by people who had never known the half of what her life had actually cost her. The crowds that grieved her grieved the Duchess, the fashion, the fame, the charisma, the public figure. Almost none of them knew about the daughter in Northumberland, or the room in the south of France, or the poem about the nameless mother. The private woman went into the ground with her secret very nearly intact, which is exactly what her family had spent 14 years arranging. What happened to the others reads like a series of quiet ironies, each one tightening the knot of this strange family a little further. The Duke, William, outlived her by 5 years, and in 1809, 3 years after Georgiana's death, he finally married Bess, Lady Elizabeth Foster, the friend who had shared his house and his bed and the whole long deception for nearly 30 years. Bess, who had borne his children in secret and watched her dearest friend, broken by the same machinery she herself had survived, became at last the Duchess of Devonshire in name as well as in fact. There is something almost vertiginous in it. the woman who had been the living instrument of Georgiana's humiliation, the third person in the marriage, stepped into the dead woman's title and stood where Georgiana had stood. She did not have long to enjoy it. The Duke died in 1811, and Bess lived out her remaining years partly abroad in Rome, among the art and the ruins, dying in 1824, opaque to the very end, the hardest figure in the story to weigh. A woman who had spent her whole life surviving by being indispensable, and who, at the close of it, was rewarded for that long indispensability with the one thing she had never had, a name of her own that no one could take away. Whether that was triumph or hollow consolation, the record does not say, and perhaps she did not know herself. The children carried the story forward into the next century, and one connection among them is so strange it would be rejected as implausible in fiction. Granville Levison Gower, Harriet's lover, the father of her two hidden children, then 1809 married Lady Harriet Cavendish, known as Harriet. And Harriet was Georgiana's daughter. She was the niece of the very woman Granville had loved and impregnated in secret. The man who had fathered hidden children on the aunt married the legitimate daughter of the aunt's sister, and the family closed around the arrangement and made it respectable. And the two secret Stuart children were quietly folded into the edges of the new household. Granville went on to become the first Earl Granville, a distinguished ambassador, a pillar of the establishment, his blameless public career untouched by the children kept in the background of it. Harriet, for her part, made the marriage work and made it last, and seems to have come to a kind of peace with the strange knot she had married into, which is its own quiet testament to how thoroughly the women of this family were trained to absorb what could not be changed. Harriet Bessborough herself lived until 1821, carrying her own hidden children and her own long silence to the end. The other daughter, little G, Georgiana Dorothy, the eldest, had married into the aristocracy years before and lived the conventional life her mother had been denied. And the two children of Bess and the Duke, the half-siblings raised inside the household, found their own footing. Caroline St. Jules married into a notable political family, and Augustus Clifford went to sea, rose through the Navy, and ended his life a knight and a baronet, a respectable establishment figure whose origins were known to those who needed to know and mentioned by no one. Hart, the long-awaited heir, the boy whose legitimacy the whole concealment had been built to protect, became the sixth Duke of Devonshire, the famous bachelor duke who never married, who poured a fortune into Chatsworth and its gardens and collections, and who, having been the reason his half-sister was sent away, ended the direct line in his own person by leaving no legitimate child of his own. There is a bleak symmetry in that the heir the family had sacrificed Eliza to protect produced, in the end, no heir at all. The line he secured passed sideways, to a cousin, when his time came. All that careful cruelty, all that managed silence, all the women made absent and the children renamed, had been in the service of a clean succession through this one boy. And the boy grew into a man who simply declined to continue it. And the great inheritance went on regardless, finding its own way down through the family by other branches, as great inheritances tend to. The thing they had broken Georgiana to protect did not even need protecting in the way they had imagined. It would have survived without the cruelty. It mostly always would have in one branch or another. And Eliza, the child at the center of it all, the one the entire machine had been built to erase, lived. That is the fact that complicates any neat ending. She grew up in Northumberland, in the keeping of Charles Grey's parents, raised as a member of the family, treated with affection, given a place. For a child whose existence had been so dangerous, she had, by the standards of the hidden children of the age, a relatively kind upbringing. Not abandoned to an institution, not left to strangers, but folded into a real household that cared for her. What she did not have was the truth, not at first. She grew up understanding herself to be something other than what she was, a Grey by some sidelong arrangement, with a grand, distant relation, the Duchess of Devonshire, who took an unusual interest in her and came to visit and send gifts and watched her with an attention no one quite explained. In time, she came to understand who that grand relation had really been. She married, had children of her own, and lived a long and apparently settled life well into the middle of the next century, carrying within her, as her mother had, a truth that could be known but not proclaimed. Her mother had loved her from a distance for all the 14 years they shared the earth, in the only way she had been permitted, as a visitor, a benefactor, a watcher, never a mother out loud. The hand unseen had done what it could. It had not been nothing, A child raised in warmth, watched over by a mother who never stopped loving her, is not the worst fate this story could have produced. But it had never been allowed to be what it was, and Eliza grew up loved and false in the same breath, which is its own particular kind of inheritance. The last act of concealment came long after every one of them was dead, and it is the one that gives the story its final modern chill. As the family's papers passed down through the Victorian generations, descendants who valued the dignity of the name more than the truth of the lives went through the letters. Georgiana's letters, the family's letters, and where the lost daughter appeared, where her name was written, where the affair with Gray or the birth in France left its trace. They took a pen and blacked it out. Picture the deliberateness of that. A descendant, perhaps 2 generations on, sitting at a desk with the family correspondence spread out, reading a dead woman's most private words and methodically going through them with ink, obliterating a child's name wherever it appeared, sentence by sentence, letter by letter. They destroyed some letters entirely. They left in the great archive at Chatsworth gaps where the truth had been. Deliberate silences scored into the paper, blank spaces where a daughter used to be. It was the same instinct that had sent Eliza to Northumberland, only now it was aimed not at the living child but at her memory, and it was carried out not in panic but at leisure by people who had never met her and simply preferred that she had not existed. The dynasty had separated mother and child in life. Generations later, it set about separating them in memory, line by inked out line, so that the official record of the family could stay cleaner than the family had ever been. And the strangest part is that they nearly succeeded. For most of 2 centuries, Eliza Courtney was a footnote at best, a rumor, a smudge in the record, a child the family had very nearly managed to unmake after the fact. That she is not a smudge today, that her story can be told at all, is largely the work of one historian. In 1998, Amanda Foreman published a biography of Georgiana, the fruit of years spent in exactly those archives, reading around the blacked out lines, reconstructing from the surviving fragments the life the family had tried so hard to tidy away. It won major prizes and became an unexpected bestseller, and it did something the inked out pages had been designed to prevent. It returned Eliza to the story, named the nameless mother, and let a wide modern public understand that the dazzling Duchess of the caricatures had been underneath, a woman broken on the wheel of her own family's respectability. The act of historical recovery was, in a sense, the exact reverse of what the Victorian descendants had done with their pens. They had worked to remove her. Foreman worked to put her back. 10 years later, in 2008, the story reached a far larger audience still, when Foreman's biography was adapted into a film. The Duchess, directed by Saul Dibb, starred Keira Knightley as Georgiana, Ralph Fiennes as the cold and exact Duke, Hayley Atwell as Bess, Charlotte Rampling as the formidable Countess Spencer, and Dominic Cooper as Charles Grey. The film got a great deal right. The coercive marriage, the suffocating triangle, the fame that solved nothing, the spectacle of a woman publicly adored and privately trapped. And at its center, the agony of the surrendered child. Its marketing leaned knowingly on a parallel that had haunted the project from the start. Georgiana was a direct ancestor of Diana, Princess of Wales, another beautiful, adored, miserably married Spencer woman, undone by a marriage that had, as the famous phrase went, 3 people in it. The poster spoke of a Spencer who scandalized the nation 2 centuries before Diana did. The echo was almost too neat, and the film made the most of it. What the film could not do in 2 hours was capture the full machinery, the repetition across the generations, the second sister and her own hidden children, the satin purse, the bureaucratic patience of the concealment, the inked-out archive. It dramatized one woman's scandal with great feeling. The system behind the scandal, the thing that made it not a tragedy but a method, was always going to be harder to put on a screen. There is a final turn worth marking because it reaches all the way back to where this story began, to the law that stood behind the houses like a second father. The whole machinery of concealment existed because the law made an illegitimate child a danger to inherited property, title, and rank, a fault line in the foundation of an estate. That law did not last forever. Slowly, across the century and more that followed Eliza's birth, the legal disabilities of illegitimacy were softened, and then, at last, in 1987, very nearly abolished altogether in England. The world that had made Eliza Courtney a thing to be hidden eventually dissolved. The reasons her mother was sent to the south of France ceased, in time to be reasons at all. And this is the part that gives no comfort, The change came 2 centuries too late for her, and for her aunt's children, and for every hidden child whose certificate was folded into a purse. The law that broke them was, in the end, repealed. It was simply repealed long after they were dust, by a society that had quietly decided the thing was monstrous, without ever quite reckoning with the particular people it had been monstrous to. Here is what remains. Spencer House still stands above Green Park and St. James's, restored to its 18th century magnificence, the palace the family built to announce that it had arrived. Visitors walk its staterooms today, 2.5 centuries after the Spencers raised it to be seen. Chatsworth is still there in Derbyshire, still the seat of the Cavendishes after nearly 5 centuries. Peregrine Cavendish, the 12th Duke of Devonshire, holds the title now, and in recent years the estate has carried out a vast program of restoration, a master plan costing some £32.7 million to keep the great house standing for the centuries to come. The park still runs to more than 1,800 acres. The pictures still hang. The line that the concealment of Eliza was meant to protect runs on, unbroken and unquestioned, into the present day. Althorpe in Northamptonshire is still the Spencer family home, open to visitors, and it is also where Diana lies buried, on an island in the lake, so that the two most famous Spencer women, separated by 200 years and joined by an uncanny rhyme of fate, are commemorated on the same ancestral ground. Only the Irish house broke the pattern. Bessborough, the seat of the Ponsonbys, passed out of the family. It was sold in 1940 and became in time an agricultural college, Kildalton, where students now learn to farm the land that once belonged to Harriet's husband's line. The houses, by and large, survived. They were restored, curated, opened to the public, handed down. They are still here, and they are magnificent, and they are visited every year by people who come for the beauty of them and know nothing of the silences folded into their foundations. The children are not, except as names in a record that was nearly altered to remove them. And that is the thing to hold on to at the end. The houses that this family built to last 200 years have lasted. The lines of descent they fought so hard to keep clean ran on. What did not survive, what was sent away and renamed and folded into purses and blacked out of letters, was the full truth of the people it cost to keep all of that standing. The great houses were never built only out of land and marriage and title. They were also built out of managed silence, out of women made absent, children renamed, love permitted only at a distance, and papers cut generations later so that the memory of the family could stay tidier than the lives had been. There is no lesson in that, no moral that ties it off. There is only a small certificate, once folded into a satin purse because a child's existence could not be spoken aloud, and a column of blacked out lines in a duchess's letters where a daughter's name used to be.